Hello and welcome back to the Diff. My name's Joe, I'm going to be your host for this evening. Thank you for joining us at another Diff session. Have you heard the word abundance at this year's Diff? I've heard it about 17 times. People say that with materials all around us, digital fabrication like 3D printing taking off, that we're going to usher in a new age of abundance where we can just push a button and create what we want or need on demand. It sounds like something straight out of Star Trek, with a Star Trek machine that can print whatever you need. If you want a sandwich, there you go. If you need a tool, you can have it on demand. But our two guests in the studio tonight think that the threads of that technology are visible today, and that some of that new era of manufacturing might be closer than we think. So in the studio with me, I've got Josie Warden, who's a senior researcher in the economy team at the RSA. And a bit later on, we're going to be hearing from Alicia Garmalevich. She's the founder of Materium and an associate professor in the circular economy. She's joining us all the way from Santiago, Chile today. So Josie, let's start with you.
Yeah.
3D printers, these kind of digital fabrication machines that I was just talking about. When the hype seemed to blow up about these machines a few years ago, there was this idea that we might all have one in our home, and we'd be able to just create what we need when we needed it. And it hasn't really happened. I mean, they're not hard to come by. You can find them in sort of workshops and some universities, but it's not this ubiquitous manufacturing technology. So how much is manufacturing really changing?
Yeah, I think there is that sense that a few years ago, everyone felt like we were going to be getting them in our houses and we were going to be using these things all the time. But actually, I'm not sure that we're really seeing that in action in that sense. But there are these kind of, like you say, threads of activity that are showing that there are new ways of doing stuff. So I think probably it's happening at the sort of larger scale end. Big firms are using new techniques, new technologies to introduce new ways of production into their machinery and their products. And also then at the other end, at the more kind of grassroots end, where maybe people can access 3D printers or other kind of digital technologies in maker spaces or in universities, the kind of, just tinkering around and playing around with things, and that at those two ends things are happening. I think it's the sort of sweep in the middle of manufacturing that's not really being taken up as quickly as it could be, and I think we're missing out on some of the opportunities within that.
What are those opportunities then, if that big chunk in the middle has benefits? Some of those are maybe not obvious to a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it comes back to this idea of what's the right scale to produce things at, and for a long time we've been looking at production and manufacturing within a particular paradigm, which is, how can we produce this most efficiently at scale, get economies of scale, and how can we reduce cost essentially in production in order to increase the profit margins. And that kind of shifted, that paradigm has assumed that we've had endless supplies of materials that will be able to deal with the waste and the pollutants afterwards, and not really consider those in the way through. So this sort of the way of looking at the circular economy completely shifts that, and it means we need to rethink what scale things should be happening at.
So that might mean. So I said at the start, producing things when you need them, that might be one benefit, that
exactly.
You could produce things in line with demand.
Yeah, so you might be able to reduce excess production, to be much more bespoke and customizable in the way you make things, so you can react very quickly to your market, and you're not having these sort of much larger product cycles and not quite knowing what's going to work with your market. And we've seen some elements of that with brands, particularly things like shoe design, and where they're kind of allowing you to customize stuff and get kind of quite quick reactions on what their customers are looking for. But it also means that we can think a bit more cleverly about the scale for different kinds of manufacturing. So whether it should happen very, very hyper-locally, maybe with things around food, or whether it should be sort of city-wide, a region-wide, or still remain a kind of global supply chain, depending on what it is that's being made. And I think that kind of chunk of businesses in the middle are where most of that will happen, where a lot of production will happen. And I think that their access to technologies it's harder to come by at the moment.
Just as we carry on talking with Josie about this new type of manufacturing and what manufacturing should happen where and at which different scale, don't forget to send your questions in. Use hashtag ThinkDiff, and or the comments box, the discussion box, which is to the side of this video, and Colin Webster, trusty wingman, will be looking out for those questions and will send them over to me. I just want to pick one of the, I like examples of this sort of thing in action. And you just mentioned food. What would that look like in the sort of local manufacturing sense?
Yeah, so we've been looking, some work I've been doing has been looking at manufacturing in cities, and we've been focusing on a few European cities. So taking London for an example, thinking about you've seen some examples of businesses which are taking food waste and repurposing it within a very small area. So creating kind of the fruit candy or preserves, or even beer from waste baked products. And I think the fact that those materials have such a short life cycle, the ability to be able to do something new with them and kind of create ecosystems within a small area of a city is a really exciting opportunity. So we're kind of seeing some of that happening quite well, I think, at that sort of city scale.
And when people, that doesn't sound particularly technologically advanced.
No.
And I think when people think about this new type of manufacturing, they straight away think of things that happen on computers and with new technologies like 3D printers. How much is that kind of misplaced, that faith in technology?
Yeah, I think that is a really, really important question. Because I think it's interesting when you think about the conversations about manufacturing, it feels like you can quite easily fall into quite big narratives that actually aren't that helpful. So you might go down the route of feeling like, oh, it's all very nostalgic to be thinking about manufacturing again. And we've seen that from the kind of Trump rhetoric around we need to bring stuff back. We also can get stuck in this kind of tech paradigm of like, oh, it's going to be all about these digital technologies and new ways of making things. And actually sometimes maybe forget about the more traditional, less high-tech manufacturing that happens. And I think that's it's really important to think about that scale and how those things fit together, because the skills that you're getting from the traditional manufacturing, the kind of connections, are the things that are going to in part contribute to new ideas and the new ways of using technology in an innovative sense.
And when you're speaking about kind of customized goods and the kind of other benefits that can come with this local manufacturing, at one end, when we talk about this abundant kind of trend towards using local materials or locally available materials, using technology to create things on demand, some people will say that will kind of perhaps bring prices down because you reduce shipping costs, you use what's locally available. At the same time, I think when people think of local, almost artisanal products, they think of actually increased prices compared with the mass-produced stuff that's shipped overseas. So is it even fair to kind of see this as one kind of cohesive movement when there seem to be a lot of quite important differences?
Yeah, I think that is true. I think that's another sort of area that you can kind of get stuck in, is the sense that by looking at more local manufacturing, it's inherently going to be high-end, luxury, expensive products, maybe slower made, investment pieces, that kind of thing. And I think you're right. I think you kind of can't really compare all these different, or you can't make all these different aspects one element. They're all part of a new story that we have to kind of develop around what production means. But there are some quite distinct things happening. And I think that question of scale is one that's really difficult to grapple with. At what scale should things happen? And it will look probably very different for transport production, through to food, through to electronic goods, and it will probably depend on where you are in the world as well, at what scale that should happen, and relative to the kind of materials and skills that are available in that area too. So I think it's quite a complex picture, and it's hard not to, you don't want to get kind of frightened of that, because there are so many different things that might move, but it's finding ways, just pulling at some strands and trying to kind of explore those a bit more, but remembering that it's part of this bigger network of changes that are happening.
And the people that typically talk about this narrative or network of changes, with all due respect, seem to be often from maybe the maker movement. But there are other people involved. I'd like to just look at two of them. Firstly, customers, citizens. Is there signs that citizens want to really access goods and services in this way?
So I guess there are a couple of different things in there, in that there's firstly, I think there is definitely, we're seeing a kind of increased interest in well-made goods where you can, the provenance of them, and that maybe has that almost that sense of high quality and connection to products. So that's kind of the longevity aspect of, I suppose, looking at circular economy. So I think there is definitely interest there, maybe as a reaction to the challenges we've seen from mass manufacturing. But there's also another scale, I think, an increased interest, or maybe not increased, but there is still an interest with people to be involved in production themselves to some extent. And the RSA did a survey a few years ago around would people be interested in getting involved in makerspaces or making the goods themselves, and more than 50% of people said they would like to be able to make things for themselves. Doesn't mean they're going to do it, but there's still some kind of desire there to be involved in that. And I think there's some untapped potential there, but it's also important not to kind of get too carried away with the idea that everyone's going to make their own things. It probably will be a small number of people, but there obviously is, I think, a sort of number of interest that people have in production. So I think it is something that's important to the customer.
Perhaps as a reaction to the era of kind of mass-produced, everyone with the same sort of products.
Yeah.
The other group I wanted to touch upon is the kind of big business.
Yeah.
Obviously, large businesses are hugely influential and direct a lot of the materials that we actually use day to day. Huge volumes of clothes, plastics, food. Are they on this trend, or are they lagging behind? What's the score there?
I think it really depends on within the business. There are some that I think that are really showing kind of interest. I think obviously Ellen MacArthur Foundation work with a lot of those who are the ones who are really trying to think about what this means for their business. But there are still a huge chunk, I think, who are it's currently not really worth their while, or they're not really thinking about it. You might look at the kind of clothing sector, for example. I think there's still a large number of companies who aren't really thinking about this at all, and it's still maybe looking at sustainability and how are our social impacts affecting people. Maybe we're looking at all using organic cotton, but it's not thinking systemically about it necessarily. And I think this kind of piece of the smaller companies, actually SMEs, is really important, because I think there's a lot of potential there for new development to happen. But actually, I think engaging with that group is probably much harder than engaging with big business or, like you say, the kind of maker movement. There's so many organisations in that sector that I think are quite hard to reach, and we found that with our work as well. Getting into those businesses has been quite challenging. I think that's where a lot of potential lies, but also there's quite a lot of barriers for kind of getting there.
We've had two really good questions in that I'll put to you now. Firstly, Brendan, who said, what role for autonomous factories in a box? Shipping containers where materials are fed in one end and output products at the other. Sounds very simple. I'm sure it's not that simple. To bring manufacturing back to cities and closer to demand. Is that a big thing, or is this?
I think there is definitely potential for that, and we've seen maybe not quite at that level, but you've seen examples of companies like Adidas bringing back manufacturing to Europe, but using it in a much more autonomous way. I think this is a really interesting point where it interacts with the labour market, and I think there's been a sense previously that manufacturing is about creating jobs, and that's why the economy seems to like it. And then this sense that actually with a lot of changes to automation, maybe there won't be that kind of level of jobs in it. But I think we're seeing that as a positive thing. There are lots of opportunities for new kinds of business models, and that the jobs that will be available in manufacture will be very different to what we've seen before. Probably a lot more focused on the kind of technology side of things and being able to manage that kind of setup. So I think there probably is potential for that kind of thing to happen in quite a small scale. But I wouldn't say it's kind of immediate steps.
Quick plug for a film coming out on Monday. I chatted with Azim Azar on the future of work. We spoke about a lot of the implications of increased automation and use of technology in manufacturing and in other sectors of the economy as well. So check that out, coming out on Monday. Last question before we move on and speak to Alicia. What's going to make my nan want to do this?
Ooh.
Is there a role for nan? Will she maybe will she do something different?
Why not? I think it's it's just bringing a completely different way of thinking about the products around you. We've been so used to not being able to, it didn't cross people's mind that you could kind of customise something or have it made for you. So I think whether it be something in the house or something around mobility, there'll be so many more opportunities for that kind of thing to happen. I think it's almost like shifting people's mindset around this is potentially something that's possible. So I think there's definitely opportunities for lots of different people. Including nans, yeah.
We're going to take a quick look at a clip now from System Reset, the amazing diffumentary that came out today. The clips of Areti Marco Polo, who picks up on a couple of the themes that we're talking about with Josie and Alicia today.
with very little cost in terms of material. With almost no transport, we are able to construct in real time sustainable, basically, buildings that they are using materials that they are 100% natural, they are biodegradable or reusable, and it can also open up possibilities of thinking that we can use those technologies for creating not only more sustainable buildings, but also more accessible ones, because the price of such constructions is much lower than traditional ones. And finally, it also opens up the possibility of using such processes in order to go into areas where there are no resources or where there are maybe extreme environmental conditions, so that you can take advantage of automated machines to create quick and accessible housings out of the same material that you can find there on site.
That was Areti Markopoulou. She's from the Institute of Advanced Architecture, Catalonia, and she was speaking as part of System Reset, the documentary we released at the Diff today. Don't miss that one. It's one of the highlights of this year's Diff. Alicia, we're going to come to you now. And Areti makes it sound fantastic. That's the sort of, I'm sure a lot of people think that's the world I want to live in, where we make things like that, faster disaster relief, things like that. But I've spotted a problem. It's not the first time we heard from your colleague Liz about Materium, and a lot of what you work on is this idea of abundant natural materials. But the problem I've spotted is that if we're talking about more manufacturing perhaps happening where the people are, in cities, most materials that we use today don't come from cities. And if I think about where I live, there's not an abundance of materials around. There's buildings and there's offices, there's roads. There's not materials lying around. So how's it actually going to work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, there's two parts to that. One is that we need new eyes to look around us, and in city environments, it's actually quite plentiful when you think about waste streams that could be turned into nutrients for manufactured goods, so in terms of materials. So take one example of bio-waste. There's a huge, plentiful amount of bio-waste coming in the form of food waste, coming in the form of human waste that's treated, etc. And we're starting to think about how to use those sources to have a regenerative impact, whether it be regenerative from agriculture or regenerative from a materials perspective, which is what we're working on. And I think it's part of a larger shift in thinking, because to take one of your points earlier around digital fabrication and 3D printing, although these are new technologies that seem really exciting and enable local manufacturing and local production, when you actually look closely, it's not local at all from a materials perspective. It's a complete contradiction in terms. And so there's a real challenge of connecting these new forms of fabrication to what is around us, what is locally abundant. And I think one of the things that you really need to talk about, first of all, is what is abundance, right? I mean, we talk about it in very loose terms, but you can think about what's, for starters, globally abundant. And that's a really important starting point. And Joe, I think we have a graph to illustrate this, for starters, in terms of what can be viewed as globally abundant when we talk about biomaterials or materials from living biomass.
Yeah, we've got that up on the screen now, Alicia.
What's great about this graph is it illustrates in tons per year what are the flows of materials that are in the biosphere. So for example, you can see that cellulose, which is half of living plant matter, basically, that composes living plants, dwarfs everything else in terms of, we're talking about 2 teratons. That's 2,000 billion tons of biomass in flow in the biosphere. By contrast, you've got chitin, which is another building block of crustaceans in ocean environments, and insect exoskeletons at about 100 billion tons, and then it goes down from there. But if you look at how that compares to our human production of petrochemical plastics, which is what's causing such a huge issue in terms of bioaccumulation and marine and terrestrial environments, you see it's about 8 billion tons since 1950. So that's not a global amount, that's not an annual amount, it's since 1950, so that's an aggregate amount. It puts it in context because when we think about all of our materials that are causing trouble, actually they're dwarfed by biomaterials, materials from living organisms that are in flow in the biosphere and are nutrients for everything. So that's an important perspective to think about what abundance means in this context.
And if I was if I was a business using a large volume of materials, I might look at that graph and think, I'm missing a trick here. There's a lot of material there that I could be using. Maybe it would be cheaper because it's so abundant. But then I would maybe remember that you can't do a lot of things that you can with petrochemicals, perhaps. Isn't safety, reliability, performance, isn't that the whole reason we use things like petrochemicals? Because we couldn't do it using things like cellulose?
Well, there's two parts to that question. The first one, to answer the technological aspects, is that we're seeing a surge and a real investment in understanding how to make high performance materials with bio-based ingredients. So, and importantly, it's about using natural chemistry methods as well. So chemistry methods that use more weak bonds rather than strong bonds, as well as solvents that are water-based. And this kind of methodology allows you to create materials from bio-based ingredients that are biodegradable. So there's a category of materials that are from bio-based sources that with industrial methods actually create materials that can't biodegrade. So it's important to differentiate that, first of all. But the second part to your question is the method of production. And this touches on what Josie was saying earlier, in the sense that we are living in a paradigm of materials production that is mass, in the sense of getting to scale is the measure of success for industrial production these days in material supply chains. And that doesn't fit with more distributed but abundant, globally abundant sources of materials like cellulose, for example. So we need to change our paradigm of manufacturing. We need to think about, if you're a large company, how can you source from many localities for local production loops? Because a lot of these biopolymers are common to many environments, but they're regionally distinct and locally distributed. So it requires a super big change in the way we manufacture in order to take advantage of these abundant biomaterials. And then we're also making them more and more high performance every day, which is where digital fabrication comes in. We're able now to layer these materials at nano, micro, meso, and increasingly macro scales, of course, in intricate patterns that allows them to be high performance without complex chemistry involved. So there's techniques like this which are pushing the envelope in terms of how to make high performance materials with basic building blocks, which is what nature does already.
What are your thoughts on this? Use hashtag ThinkDiff or the chat box next to the video to send your questions in for Alicia or Josie. Last one from me, Alicia. This, again, the tendency might be to look at that big, large volume of cellulose and say, even if some people might say, if you we're just shifting the problem elsewhere. We're using less petrochemicals, but we're plundering this supply of cellulose. To which the response might be, well, don't worry, there's loads of it. But there was a time when we didn't really worry about chucking stuff in the ocean or in the atmosphere or in holes in the ground. And the negative impacts of that only emerge further down the line. So is that something you're worried about?
So it's a very, very important starting principle for guiding development in this area. First of all, I think it's worth making the point that every single locality that wants to embark on creating new materials and new material supply chains needs to think about what makes sense within a particular locality in a specific region. And that includes like cultural and socioeconomic aspects, as well as what the biophysical environment gives. To give an example of this, we've got some plastics here that were made in Chile. These are from seaweed. And in Chile, it makes a lot of sense to use seaweed for bioplastic because we have a huge coastline, a lot of abundance. However, there's a really interesting interaction effect when thinking about local production from seaweed bioplastics, which is changing the market paradigm of what happens now. What happens now is that seaweed is an export product for other food additives, cosmetics, etc., that are made in China predominantly. And so seaweed is bundled up, extracted from the sea, bundled up and shipped over. So there's very little value that's retained at a local level. So the idea of creating more localized manufacturing for bioplastics and then adding value from like digital manufacturing technologies for higher value products would enable social development and economic development at a local level. The other aspect is governance. And governance is super important for this new paradigm to be what you're saying, to be socially inclusive as well as ecologically regenerative. Because governance has to emerge from these localities to govern the cycling of these nutrients in appropriate ways. So a lot of these materials are actually coming from commons resources, so resources that are not privatized, and privatization is not necessarily the best way to govern them anyways. So the development of rules and ways of governing for common pool resources are incredibly important and must vary at a local and regional scale. So it requires new rules for governance to emerge along with this new manufacturing paradigm in order to have the right incentives, the right feedback to put nutrients back into the cycle and not have an extractive paradigm emerge here.
So lots to think about as we think about the convergence of local manufacturing, new manufacturing techniques, and using a different, locally abundant source of materials in the future of the way that we make things. As you think about more questions for our great guests today and send them in, it wouldn't be the Diff without a what's next section, which I nearly messed up on. We're going to hear what's coming next at the Diff, and then we're going to play a silly game after that.
Hola amigos, my name is Laura and I am part of the Diff team, and I want to recommend 3 sessions for you guys. Imagine if every citizen was given a sum of money by the state, every year. This is the interesting idea that will be discussed tomorrow at 5 GMT time in the Diff Studio session called Universal Basic Income, an idea whose time has come. If you're interested in intelligent material choices and life-friendly chemistry, I definitely invite you to join the Diff Studio session next Monday at 1 p.m. called Holding It All Together. And if you are even more passionate about materials, I would recommend that you watch the recording of the Diff Studio session last Monday called Materials and Making in the Diff Studio, with the amazing Zoe Laughlin to see some material experiments and maybe some things getting broken. Thank you, and back to you in the studio.
I didn't miss Laura's update on some of the sessions not to miss at the Diff, especially the Zoe Laughlin session, which I had the pleasure of being part of last week. It was an absolute cracker. Okay, the Diff Game. Every year we do some ridiculous games, and today we're looking at this whole topic of science fiction technologies. We started out by talking about these 3D printing technologies, which are a bit like something out of Star Trek, which has led me, that's the inspiration for science fiction or good prediction.
Very nice.
No expense spared as ever on the production for our jingles here at the Diff. Okay, the game is very simple, Josie and Alicia. Science fiction or good prediction. I'm going to show you a science fiction technology, and you need to tell me whether it's never going to happen, it's going to stay within the realms of science fiction, or you've seen something that makes you think it could be just around the corner.
Okay.
And a disclaimer now, I was going to use screenshots from all our favourite science fiction movies, but I didn't want us to get sued, so I've recreated them in pen drawing. So let's have the first challenge. Okay, this one's a bit of an easy one. The on-demand replicator from Star Trek. You push a button, you say, I want a burger, and it appears before your eyes. What do you think?
Ding, ding, ding. Do we have buzzers?
You don't have buzzers,
Okay,
you just
fine.
have to vocalise.
I think good prediction.
Good prediction,
Yeah.
Alicia?
Yeah, agreed.
Good prediction. I mean, we've been talking about it all session. That's correct. It's a good prediction.
Wait.
I mean, we're a long way of being able to have a burger on demand,
yeah,
aren't
I'm not
we?
sure about that. Maybe one day.
One
Yeah,
day.
maybe
All right,
one day.
let's go on to the next one. You get the game. Invisibility. Science fiction or good prediction?
Good prediction.
Why?
I think I've seen some invisibility cloaks.
Do you mean the Harry Potter doesn't count?
Oh, I know. I think even not in Harry Potter.
Alicia?
I want to believe so badly.
Okay. So you're both going
Yeah, I'm going good prediction.
good prediction. It is a good prediction.
Oh, hey.
Scientists in the United Kingdom have moved a step forward in the real-world quest for invisibility. They've developed a surface wave cloak, which makes curved surfaces appear flat. Basically, it means they become invisible. So surface wave cloak is just around the corner. Next up, cryogenic reanimation. So you've been frozen, you want to wake up in the year 3000. What do you think? Science fiction or good prediction?
Science fiction.
Why?
I think it's because I don't want it to happen.
You wouldn't like that?
No. I think that's far too terrifying.
I'd love that.
You'd like
Really?
that?
Okay, you can go.
Which year would you wake up in, Alicia?
Oh, goodness. I'd like to see 2100. That would be fun.
Okay, well, is it science? You've gone science
I'll go
fiction.
science fiction,
Alicia,
yeah.
you going good prediction?
Yeah.
It's science fiction.
Hey.
Apparently, your brain turns to mush when you get frozen, and they haven't found a way to unmush your brain.
Oh, shit.
Okay, let's have the next one. Flying car. Science fiction or good prediction?
Do we not?
Good prediction.
Yeah, good prediction. Well, in a form
You're not
of
that impressed by
form
that
of
one, I can
transport-
tell.
No, I like this picture, but form of transport that can fly. Is it fly and then drive?
I think so.
Yeah. Surely that's going to happen.
It's a good prediction. Apparently, air taxi startup Kitty Hawk already has FAA approval to test its prototype. Boeing, German startup Volocopter, planning test in Singapore next year. So you could have got
Good
here
names.
to Diff HQ
Yeah.
in a flying car,
You should
I
get
think.
one when they come to market.
Next year,
Okay.
that's how you're going to
That's how
come
we're
to the
gonna get
studio.
stuff.
Okay, 2 more to go. Lightsaber. Science fiction or good prediction? Looks like a cucumber, but it is a lightsaber. What do you think?
Science fiction.
Yeah, science fiction.
Both gone science fiction straight
Although,
away.
That would be good.
Don't think it's going to happen.
No.
It is science fiction. Apparently, you can't get a laser or a beam of light to just stop randomly after about 3 foot. So it's not going to
It's not gonna
happen.
happen.
And the whole thing about 2 lightsabers meeting and it just doesn't work. Science fiction. You can keep your lightsaber, Darth. Next up, last one, hoverboard. Science fiction or good prediction?
Good prediction.
Why?
I think it's inevitable. Surely it's a scale. That's kind of small scale. It's got to be possible.
What do you reckon, Alicia?
Yeah, good prediction.
Okay, I'm sorry, you've failed at the final hurdle. Science fiction. Apparently, you need lighter air than gas, so you might be surfing around on a blimp.
Right.
Rockets, which no one's going to fly around on a rocket. You need to or it's a hovercraft, right, because you're pushing air down, or magnetic levitation, so you need to go around only where there's metal floors. So we're
So
going to
in a-
leave that one in the realm of science
In a
fiction, I'm
metal
afraid.
floored room, you might be all right.
Okay, well, all right, I'll give you a
That's what I
pass on that one. If you disagree with me and you've spotted some technology that makes a hoverboard real, then please tell me about it at Joe Isles, Twitter, direct. Okay, let's get back to something a bit more sensible now. We've been talking locally abundant materials, local manufacturing, using new technology. So this word local's come up a lot, but local to what? I mean, there are different scales of local. So I'd like to hear from you guys, what could this look like at different scales? So when these trends or technologies converge, what does it mean for us at different scales of locality? So what about if we start off perhaps in home? So locally abundant materials, local manufacturing in the home. What does that look like? Josie, let's start with you.
Well, I suppose in terms of local manufacturing stuff, there's the opportunity, maybe there is still opportunity for more kind of in-home kit. Probably not with the 3D printer stuff, but people being able to customise or modify things in small ways to be able to make them more useful for them. Or people being able to access and purchase products that have been made really very, very locally. So that might be things like furniture, people like Open Desk who are providing opportunities for people to be able to manufacture stuff very locally and purchase it. And then the customizable stuff that people are seeing already around maybe tweaking designs for something that they can kind of use themselves. But I'm really interested to hear what the kind of materials stuff might be in the home as well.
Yeah, is it a case that what came in as our online shop one day is going to be the products of tomorrow, Alicia?
In the home, there's an incredible wealth of materials that we don't really tap into. First of all, there's in the biomaterial space, there's a lot of food waste that can be used. So we've been making and experimenting with materials such as coffee grounds, different types of starch. You can imagine a garden being integrated, both in terms of growing things in your house, but also in a small garden that you might have. And so within the home environment, you can imagine the cycling of nutrients from materials that could be made into products that could be composted or then dissolved in your sink and then back in. And I think to pick up on one theme of why this is so important when you think about local is the theme of participation, because materials in today's world are so remote often from people's understanding, or they're professionalized from like other disciplines like, chemists and material scientists. And while there's huge knowledge there, we need to bring that into different types of groups and heterogeneous actors in our society. And starting from the home is really powerful, because you only need a kitchen to be able to make a lot of these plastics that we're experimenting with. You need a pot and a stove, and that's it. And so there's incredible agency there within the home environment for a new materials economy.
Can I come back on that? I think that's really true for the manufacturing and making side too. It's that participation and the kind of interface of getting people experimenting and trying things. I think we've seen a kind of, I'm talking from the kind of UK, European view here, but that sort of shift away from manufacturing being something that people are aware of. They don't know how stuff is made, they don't know where it's made. I think anything that kind of engages people in getting in participating in that and learning about it, and then that being a kind of interface into them doing more things is really, really important.
And to go back to that person's nan earlier on, we've all had a nan who's knitted us a scarf. That's the type of manufacturing that happens in the home. But we're not just talking about things that happened years ago. There's this kind of fusion of some old practices, but meeting some very new practices and the creation of much more than just scarves and knitted jumpers.
Yeah, but that's also, I think that is really important, that kind of sense that it's, yes, there'll be new technologies and people will do amazing things with that, and they already are, but there's actually also loads of other stuff that we used to do and have lost a little bit, or maybe are less interested in. And I think we are seeing a kind of resurgence of interest in that, and I think that's a way in again. It's really important.
We've got a question here from Paolo who's talking about this home scale, this home level of scale. Do you think that this first big push for home 3D printers will be manufacturers giving us the exact specs of all the components in our stuff? That way we could print off all the pieces that we break.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think that was a kind of idea that we go down that route and we could replace and repair bits and pieces that have come off from our stuff. And I think I can't see home 3D printers being a really big thing. I think
could it be something for something very specific though? I think of a coffee machine where a provider, Espresso or whoever, sell you a coffee machine, an electronic device, and they sell you the kit to go in it as a way to kind of pull you into that ecosystem. Could it work like that?
I guess I think it could in terms of getting people engaged in it. I think I'm imagining more than a sort of neighbourhood scale for that stuff to work very practically. But I think as a kind of engagement tool, that you can imagine that happening. I'm not sure whether I think that's definitely the right way to go, but I think that
no, it might. I mean, there's all sorts of people concerns around copyright and people's
and also just
agency in those systems.
Yeah, I think these things should be giving people more agency and not kind of replicating something that is available at a bigger scale at the moment. But I think actually it's also not having not having 3D printers not being used in places. I think that would, I imagine if you think like normal printers in houses, really not used very much, you don't necessarily need that kit to be there. It might be better if it worked at a more neighbourhood or local
Well,
area
let's go
scale.
on to that then, because our next level of scale was what is the neighbourhood level. What sort of changes can you see?
I can see from a materials perspective, the diversity then just goes up in terms of the materials palette, and the knowledge potential as well to combine different types of expertise, areas of interest, etc. So that pooling of kind of human capital and knowledge is really important at the neighborhood scale, as well as coordinating resources from the perspective of making materials. I think one thing to pick up on just what you're talking about 3D printing is that I see 3D printing and other digital fabrication tools increasingly as machines to make materials rather than to just make objects. Because when we're looking at the ability to, say, pattern a material with like a laser cutter or create an intricate honeycomb into a bioplastic that maybe is molded or printed directly, these are the kind of techniques that you can use. And when you do that, you can create way more high-performing materials that could be used at a local scale or, at home scale or a neighborhood scale for many different uses. So I think shifting our perspective a little bit around these technologies to think of them as making and fabricating our material world and not just our final products is super important to their use case.
Let's move up through the scales now, if that's all right. We've only got a few minutes left. I want to make sure we've got some questions coming in as well. What about the city level? We've spoken a little bit about it already, but all the stats around the number of people who will be living and working in cities in the future, they seem to be where the action is. So what does this look like at the city scale?
I think on this, I want to pick up a few points that Leslie was talking about before around the ability for manufacturing at that scale to be about inclusion and about building a space in the city that people want to live and exploring challenges for that particular city. So I think I would hope that you'd see that the stuff that comes out of London being very different to Manchester or Bristol or Paris or Brussels, are very different kind of challenges that are coming out of those cities and people being able to respond to those locally. And I think about kind of bringing manufacturing back into a space where it's included in the kind of public consciousness, and it's a way that they can you can interact with your city and the places around you and build your neighbourhood and shape it and react to things that are around you. I think that would be really exciting if we can kind of go down that route, I think.
Alicia, any thoughts on that, and perhaps an example of this sort of thing, if you're aware of any?
At the city level or
At the city
regional
level? At the city level.
The city level. Well, one thing that comes to mind that at a city scale is super important is the integration of more intelligence into our material flows, because at the moment we just throw a lot of stuff away as well as consume a lot of things without understanding actually the composition of the nutrient value of these things. So for example, there are citrus fruits as well as actually a really good example is tomatoes. So tomato skin, which is often pulped or just thrown away from some industries, but is often discarded or in food waste, is actually a beautiful source of suberin, which is a biopolymer that's waterproof, that's actually super hydrophobic. And so the intelligence to understand what is the actual composition of all of the ingredients we're throwing away would be incredible in the hands of many. In the sense of how could we make, say, hydrophobic and waterproof plastics at a local level? Perhaps, it's by taking tomatoes out of the compost, for example. So this kind of thing is really about knowledge and about opening up access to A, the recipes for making materials, but B, the intelligence for the actual ingredients themselves.
And that sort of thing gets more interesting at scale, is what I'm hearing.
Yes.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, so just quickly, zoom right out. What about the kind of rural or regional level and then global level? Just quickly, perhaps starting with you, JC.
So I think something that's really interesting in this sense is looking at the geography of places and how they fit together. So a very different comparison is we're doing some work at the moment around food and farming. And actually, in the past, we've kind of looked at trying to place catchments on areas which don't fit the geography. I think in cities you can do that because you're kind of creating a human-centric defined boundary, but actually when it comes to materials and the landscape, you need to react to that, and there's a movement in food and farming to be more kind of catchment based, so look at a river basin or look at a geographical feature and respond to that in a much more sensitive way. So I think that seems like it's going to be a really important thing here too, to respond to those geographical and cultural networks in order to allow this to happen.
Thoughts, Alicia?
Approach which sits within a biome is really important because, well, just considering biomes, for example, in Chile, where I'm at in Santiago, we actually are living in a biome that's super similar to Mediterranean Europe. So understanding what are the connective threads between regions in different parts of the world on the basis of the biophysical environment will allow us to share knowledge much more intelligently. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is to pan it to the global level. When we're thinking about global flows, we can transition from flows of materials to flows of data and flows of knowledge, because a lot of these compounds and these materials that are abundant at a global level are locally variable, certainly, but they're actually very a common language we can understand and share information about. So we can actually collectively develop new materials while adapting them for local feedstock.
Thank you both for that great tour through how the convergence of local manufacturing, locally available materials could look through the many different scales that we interact with in our daily life. We've had a question, or I should say a comment in, specifically for you and me, Josie, saying that we've got lovely shoes on.
I know, yeah, I did spot that when we came in.
Someone said the jury's out on Alicia's, but the rumour is that Alicia's also got some jazzy shoes on as well.
Yeah.
Thank you both for joining us here in the Diff studio and all the way from Santiago, Alicia. So it's not just Star Trek. Some of these trends could change the way that we make things in the future and what we make them out of. For more on this topic, do check out all the content here at the Diff, especially in the materials and design track, and especially System Reset, the documentary that I mentioned earlier on that was released today. Loads more going on at the Diff. Stay with us and we'll see you next time.